My name is Reddy. I'm here with the Honorable Judith S. Kaye, former Chief Judge of the New York Court of Appeals. We're about to embark on Chapter 2 of Judge Kaye's oral history, which will address law school and early law firm life. But first, Judge Kaye, would you like to address the context of where we are now?
Yes, absolutely. I'd just like to spend a moment on ambiance. We are sitting here in my Skadden office. This is my afterlife, my after Chief Judge life. And we're high up on the 47th floor of 4 Times Square looking out on the Hudson River. But I wanted to point out particularly 2 things in my office which are so much a part of my life. And the first is that behind me are photographs of the Court of Appeals. I will surround myself as much as possible in every conceivable way with the Court of Appeals of the State of New York, which was my life for more than 25 years and always will be. And the second is that at my door, the doorstop, is a red shoe. And that, for me, is symbolic too. In fact, I'm wearing red. I love the color red. I'm associated with the color red. But red shoes in particular. And the significance of red shoes, and I have lots and lots of red shoes that I wear, red shoes that I display, red shoes that people give me, little souvenir knickknacks kind of things. But that originated with my thought, and I think it was part of a speech one day, that we need more people wearing red shoes on the bench. And that is the symbolic meaning of the red shoe. We have to kick open doors, and I mean, men can wear red shoes with high heels, that's okay with me, but I really have in mind women. And I think we need more women kicking open doors to partnerships in law firms like this, to positions of importance in whatever it is that they do. And in particular, since we have the nerve to call ourselves the justice system, we need more people at the helm, more women at the helm of the justice system. More people wearing red shoes on the bench, and that's the significance, the symbolic significance. But as long as I've paused and taken Anne off course, I want to mention one more thing that's very, very dear to me, and that's the Historical Society of the Courts of the State of New York. I can't tell you exactly the moment that the Historical Society originated. I know that it had its true development when Marilyn Marcus came with us, and that would have been late 2004. But the seeds of it, as with most good ideas, were much earlier. It takes a while to nurture and grow good ideas. And maybe it was the arrival of Al Rosenblatt on the bench of the state of New York. I wondered for all the time I was there. I was always curious, and I was there since 1983 at the Court of Appeals. I was always curious about who inhabited my chamber before I was in it. It was impossible even to know that. The Court of Appeals, I mean, we're very precedent bound, but in terms of our own history, the history of our own court, the history of the courts of the state of New York, we were just not really good about keeping it for ourselves and for future generations. And so Al Rosenblatt, wonderfully curious, endlessly, boundlessly curious person that he is, he and I would often talk about these things. I remember once asking our public information officer for some sort of history of our building, of the people who occupied the building, who used the books. There were handwritten remarks in some of the books that were in my chambers. Whose handwriting is that? And the public information officer at the time had started keeping little folders of the judges, just really not much, not even an inch thick. But Judge Rosenblatt became interested in that. Once Judge Rosenblatt is interested in something, beware, because he will take it to its very depths. And over the next years, he began enlarging those little folders, learning more and more and more about the judges. Eventually, of course, there was that wonderful book published, more than 1,000 pages on judges of the Court of Appeals. I think it's wonderful that we have this chronicle and this description of the Court of Appeals. What I love even more about the book is that it brought the whole court together. Each of us wrote chapter. I wrote a chapter. I wrote the chapter on Cardozo. We all wrote chapters. And there we were digging into the history of the Court of Appeals, and then the interest broadened and broadened and broadened, as justifiably it should have, to the court system in general in the state of New York. We have a great court system in the state of New York. We have a great history and a great heritage. And so with our extraordinary, I don't know what to call her, librarian, another person boundlessly curious and very scholarly and marvelous at research and everything else, Frances Murray, she joined forces with Judge Rosenblatt and me, and we were sort of rolling along until we hit Maryland, found Maryland, and got structure and organization, and boy, has this ever taken off. And so I've diverted you long enough, Anne, but I couldn't resist giving a little chapter, because now we have a genuine organization. We have a genuine publication. We have for which people compete to appear in, unless I brush them aside and put one of my own articles in. But it's so exciting to have finally, at long last, this absolutely first-rate historical society of the courts of the state of New York, which puts on programs, has publications, has these oral histories. It's so exciting that it's taken us so long, but we are here, and that's what's important. Now, where were we?
Well, Judge, we'll have to go back to 1959.
1959, okay, that's a long time ago.
You had recently left the Hudson Dispatch. You were working as a copy editor by day, and you had entered the New York University Law School night program.
Right.
For your first year of law school. Do you recall what that first year of law school, which is daunting to so many students, was like for you?
I think utterly terrifying. As I've told you, I didn't really intend to be a lawyer. I intended simply to get off the social page of the Hudson Dispatch or the copy editor job that I had. And suddenly I was in a very serious place where, and maybe the night school even more serious, because there were, I don't know how many, a couple of hundred maybe 100, I can't remember the number, overwhelmingly accountants, engineers, and police and now these people coming to night law school, they were dead serious about what they were doing. These people really, really were committed to being great lawyers. They put themselves out a lot to be there. So it was kind of a terrifying atmosphere, but I swallowed hard and squared my shoulders and just went about my business. And I do remember, I know you're going to come back to this, Anne, about raising hands and participating in class and that sort of thing. It's an inevitable question. I never did. I just sort of shrunk and hoped nobody would call on me or notice me. But there was a critical moment there that first year. There are these life-changing moments, and there was one that very first semester, because we had only a couple of exams at midterm. The big courses, for example, contract law, which was totally bedeviling to me. The exam wasn't until the end of the year. But there was a course in civil procedure where the exam was at the midterm. Now here I was going to be found out. And we must have been seated alphabetically. I think so. I was seated next to somebody named Kurt Schaffert, who was an engineer and brilliant, and older also, significantly older. And Kurt always said great things in every class. He understood contracts. He really got it. And civil procedure and everything. But the first exam period rolled around, and I was mummified by that point, just terrified that I was going to be busted out. At the NYU Law School at the time, I don't know whether this is true to this day, there was an anonymous exam taking, anonymous grading. So we had numbers. When the grades came back, I got something close to perfect, and Kurt got something close to 60. He knew, and I knew, that our numbers had gotten switched. There was no other explanation for it. And I put among the most terrifying days of my life the day that Kurt went to see his exam paper, because I knew it was going to be mine and not his. And lo and behold, it wasn't. I genuinely earned that grade. And the way I earned it was that I thought about the subject matter, which was civil procedure. I read the question very carefully, which was about credibility of witnesses and some procedural mechanism. It was in the context of a contract law question, that's true. And guess what? Kurt wrote about contract law. I wrote about civil procedure. So I say I learned a really valuable lesson, apart from not being totally negative about oneself. I began learning that. I learned that if you're about to address a subject, consider what the subject is and speak to it, and not something else that you happen to know better. And that was really an invaluable lesson in law school. What happened to me is I was soaring. There may have been one other grade, one other exam, I don't remember, but I was really way at the top of the class. It starched me up. I did okay in contracts at the end of the year too. But getting a near perfect grade in civil procedure, we used to have number grades at the time. I don't know what they do today. But having a number like that really boosted everything up. And the additional thing that happened is that I can't remember whether it was a class in legal writing. And by the way, I have a lot of views about classes in legal writing at law school, which should not be taught by an adjunct who comes for 2 hours a week to the law school. Should be equivalent in stature to contracts and everything else. It's really important. But there was a paper I wrote that first year, and I did it, not surprisingly, advocating for a journalist testimonial privilege. I wanted to write about journalism, and I wrote it on the journalist testimonial privilege, and guess what? It got published in something called the Intramural Law Review. Now, I don't know, I didn't know about the Intramural Law Review going in. I don't know what's happened to it. You know, it actually got picked up by other law reviews too, like I remember finding it in some foreign translation. But here I had suddenly great grades, and I had my first writing published in the Intramural Law Review. Not bad. So entering my second year of law school, I was in a considerably better state than my first year of law school. And in fact, during that year, I made the decision to seek scholarship aid and to transfer into the day division, which I did. And I even had the good sense / nerve to approach the editor-in-chief of the NYU Law Review, and to suggest that I be made a member of the Law Review.
So Judge, that early success with your civil procedure exam must have given you some confidence. However, you were one of how many women at the law school?
Well, I do remember in my graduating class, which got to be the class of 1962, we were about 10 women out of 300. How many were in the night school? Honest, I can't remember. Very, very, very few, that's for sure. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that in particular. I certainly noticed it, but I had my grief and my anxiety went beyond my gender. It included my gender, and it went beyond my gender. I've already told you that I wasn't the person who shot my hand up all the time. But suddenly I was doing better than they were, so that was a big spur to going onward, upward and onward.
Was there the Socratic method at your law school?
Meaning which particular?
Well, for me, meaning that you would be asked a particular question that you really couldn't avoid.
I guess some of that for sure, and the one time I think I got it right between the eyes was in some kind of tax class, where I was really thrown for a loop and called on, and I to this day I say it's another one of those unforgettable moments that I answered the professor's question, just dying on the inside of turmoil. He asked me what I was basing my answer on, which I think he meant which sections of the Internal Revenue Code, And I said, well, just my common sense. And it worked. Everybody laughed and he let me alone. So I think, was I squeaking? I think I was more than squeaking by. I was flourishing.
Did you have any women professors or teaching assistants or anything?
I remember 0 women professors, and I remember no teaching assistants of any sort back in the late 50s and early 60s. There are a couple of women who are very close friends and stand out in my mind to this day, and they're still good friends. Eleanor Fox, who then made her life teaching at the NYU Law School. She was a year or 2 ahead of me. Roberta Carmel, I remember, she became a commissioner of the SEC, and we became good friends. She was 1 year ahead of me. No, I think we finished together because I did move into the daytime class full-time. Nancy Stagg, I remember a couple of women, and we did network and bond with one another. Not about women's, it was never a matter of gender. I had very good male friends too. I say just gender was not at the top of my list at that time, as it shortly got to be.
So one of your first year successes was the law review.
Correct.
And how did you join the law review?
Well, I think it occurred to me, I think I kind of instigated it, and once I successfully moved into the day division, that meant getting a scholarship, because my parents, well, first of all, I don't think they could readily have afforded it, and second of all, because they were not the most eager advocates for my becoming a lawyer. I'm not sure at that point that I was yet set on being a lawyer, but I think I was. But I got a scholarship. I was living downtown at the time. I got a place to live, so suddenly it all came together for me, and I remember going to meet the editor-in-chief of the NYU Law Review. His name was William Williams, and he, just nice coincidence, he went to Sullivan and Cromwell. We got to be later, but I'm jumping ahead of myself. We got to be associates at Sullivan and Cromwell together. But I went to see Bill about the possibility of my coming on to the Law Review. I notice now that law reviews are more open in the sense that grades are one way to get on them generally. Writing ability and grades, some combination. At the time, they were pretty strict about grades, entitling people to be on the law review. And the whole atmosphere was a lot hazier about night law students transitioning into the day division. I don't know how many we were anyway, but it was definitely out of the rule book. I went to see Bill. I said I thought I should be on the law review because my grades were good enough, and he said, do you have a writing sample? I opened whatever I was carrying, and I pulled out the intramural law review, and I just remember Bill laughing because he didn't anticipate that now entering in my second year of law school, I already would have published a note. But I think that cinched it, to give him my writing sample in the form of a published law review article. And so I did get on to the NYU Law Review, and I enjoyed it. It was good. I wrote a note that second year, a case note. You know of my interest in Spanish, and it was about the active state doctrine, and it was a case called, I haven't thought about this in years. It was the National Bank of Cuba against Sabatino, and it was a very big case in international law, the active state doctrine. If I can divert for just a moment, and of course you can't say no, I remember calling one of the lawyers as I was preparing my case note for the law review. I identified myself. I said, I'm Judy Smith, and I'm on the NYU Law Review. He said, goody for you. Now, that goes in the unforgettable comment too, but I guess I deserved it. But my note got published in the NYU Law Review. And in the third year, I did my big note, and that got published too, because my interest was very much in the area of trademarks and copyrights. There was a fabulous law professor at the law school, Walter Derenberg, who captured me completely into the field of intellectual property. I just really loved it, and maybe that also related to my love of the press and journalism, and it all kind of went together. But I did my note on copyright misuse, and that got published in the NYU Law Review. So I think if you thought, Anne, that there was anything thematic about my love of language, then I think there's something thematic about my love of writing, and it's certainly, I think it was the key to whatever success I had in law school. And I'm back to my plea to law schools to have more legal writing. I think so. Legal writing is so critical to the practice of law, and it just does tend to get so sidelined in law school. And here it's so important. And for me, the ability to see a problem, just like a reporter formulating the lead paragraph. You don't look for the least important things, you look for the most important things, you look for the heart of the problem, the crux of the issue. You want to get it right up there, you want to say what you want to say as efficiently as possible. You don't want long run-on sentences, you don't want Latin, you don't want semicolons. I mean, I think those were very good things that I brought with me to law school. And I think that undoubtedly is what helped me get through the initial period and then get ahead in the later period.
So Judge, you brought a love of language and a writing ability to law school. Did law school change you, or did it develop those skills in a way that you hadn't foreseen as a journalist?
I think I would have to answer yes, res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself in the sense that writing has always been a great love of mine, a passion of mine, and so has the law, and so has government, and so has our great democracy and political issues, and everything just kind of came together for me in law school. And through writing. I've told you how important it was all through my career in law school, and you certainly know how important it was because you were there, Anne, during my years at the Court of Appeals. And I can assure you in all the in-between years the same thing was true. I've always loved to write. It helps my thought process. I'm an extreme note-taker. Not a verbatim note taker, but an organizing note taker. If the speaker hasn't organized what he or she is saying, I do. I just, the written word to me is really important. I'm still a journalist.
Before we move on to the daunting task of finding a job after law school, was there anything else that stood out about your law school years, either politically, socially, mentors, friends?
Oh goodness, I think I was really blessed in law school, and I didn't, I regret that I didn't notice even yet how much in the minority I was, how different my life was as a woman from that of all of the people around me. I had very, very good male friends, very, very good male professors, all male professors. Why didn't I notice? That as I look back, while I look back on my law school years with great pleasure, I just kick myself every now and then for not having awakened sooner to what should have been evident to me. I was very keyed in on getting through. That was always important to me. But I can't think of anything in particular that stands out, and maybe as we go on,
Sure.
After our last session together, that night, it's like making an argument in court. You prepare so diligently, and you have that kind of mock argument, then you have the real argument, and then you have the night, that haunts you in your sleep. So you keep thinking of things, but offhand, I can't think of anything in particular that stands out.
So you were set to graduate in, I believe it was August of 1962.
Yes. It had to be August because I had a year and a half at night, and here I was graduating. I was going to be considered a member of the class of 1962. They had had a year and a half of day school, so I had to make up some credits, and I went in the summer of 1961, and I went in the summer of 1962. So I didn't complete my law school requirements until August of 1962.
And you began to look for a job prior to graduation?
I did. By that time, I was one of the crowd of the class of '62, and so I was considered by the employment office to be somebody out looking for a job when they all were. Clearly, by this time, I knew I was not going back to the world of journalism, that I was going to seek employment in a law firm. I didn't do that the first year, 1961. I didn't look for, I don't think it was as common as it is today about second-year law students having summer employment in law firms. But I did work for a publishing company, Matthew Bender, as a summer job when I finished that second year of law school, the second semester full-time. But there in the third year I was in the swim, yes. I was in the swim with my classmates who were looking for employment. Member of the Law Review, high placed in the class, all doors closed to me, everything closed, yeah. There was a wonderful lady in the employment office, Dorothy, don't remember her last name, and I remember her saying to me, "It will be interesting to see how you do." Yeah, I thought it would be interesting to see how I did also.
So did you have any interviews prior to the doors closing?
Well, the fact that I think I did not have any interviews, and I sent out letters. Poor Dorothy would try to get people to see me, and I had pretty much solid closed-door rejection. The answer, if anybody answered my letter, it would be, "Our quota of women is filled," and that was a common expression big firms used back then. So that meant either that they had one woman or their quota was zero. I can hardly think of an interview that I had. I doubt that there were on-campus interviews back then. I surely do not remember that. And trying to get interviews at firms was really impossible. I did apply to the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., because I've told you about my interest in intellectual property, particularly copyrights, trademarks, all things of that nature. And I did have an offer from the FTC. But I had decided, and maybe the theme of all this is perverseness, I don't know, but the more I got rejected, the more it became absolutely imperative that I get into one of those Wall Street, white shoe law firms. I just wasn't going to take no for an answer, and that's all I was getting was no for an answer. So that made life interesting. So here I am, back at the firm of Casey, Lane and Mittendorf, for my second interview, the only second interview that was offered to me by anyone, the person who greeted me was a very wonderful gentleman, a friend to this day, a distinguished federal judge, a judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, Robert Sweet. In fact, he was a member of this law firm, such a small world. But when I came into Bob Sweet's office, and he said his partners insisted that he make this offer to me of employment, which sounded already nice to me. I didn't know what the negative was. And he genuinely hoped I would turn down the offer. He found it offensive. The offer was that they would pay the going rate for a man, from one of my male classmates. But I think at the time it was like $7,200 a year. That's what it was. But they would pay me $6,400. I turned that down. That was the first, I must say, that was the first real arrow that I felt. I was dealing with everything else, the fact that I didn't feel comfortable raising my hand in class, the fact that I thought I was failing, the fact that nobody would give me an interview. Somehow I was absorbing everything, but that was an arrow that really stung, and I did not feel like a second-class citizen, and I did fulfill Judge Sweet's wish, and I turned the offer down right then and there. But what they didn't know, and was just unimaginable to me, was that very same day, I had an interview at Sullivan and Cromwell, which was down the street, still on Wall Street. I was still intent to get that utterly impossible offer from one of those what they called white shoe law firms. I went to Sullivan and Cromwell. I don't recall how many people I saw. I do remember the last person who saw me made me an offer of employment at the same salary as everybody else was getting. I mean, where did this come from? This was just unbelievable. I refer to it as a miracle. And what really astounds me more than anything else is my response. I must have been nuts. I said, I'd like to think it over. Now, why did I do that? I don't know. And I've repeated that story to people over the years, and the last person I told it to said, if he were the one in that seat, he would have said, if you have to think it over, never mind. But fortunately, John, whatever his name was, the managing partner at Sullivan and Cromwell at the time, was far more gracious than that. And he said, fine, just let us know when you've made up your mind. I sailed out of 48 Wall Street. I was on air. I knew, of course, that I would accept that offer, and I did accept that offer.
Were there any other women at Sullivan and Cromwell?
Yes, there were two women in what was acceptable and traditional and okay back at that time, was to have a woman in the estates department, trusts and estates. And at Sullivan and Cromwell there were two women. There was Shirley O'Neill and Maureen Jorgensen. But I didn't want to be in trusts and estates. I wanted to be a litigator. And of course in litigation there were no women. So my answer to your question is yes and no. Yes, there were women at Sullivan and Cromwell at the time, and no, there were no other women in litigation or in corporate, or I don't remember what other departments they had, but I made clear that I wanted to be in the litigation department, and I was hired for the litigation department. They didn't have one of these revolving spots for new associates. I went right into the litigation department.
So at the time that you began at Sullivan and Cromwell, had you taken the bar exam?
No, I had not taken the bar exam. This was one consequence of my kind of different schedule, because I had to be in law school the summer when my classmates, whose graduation was May or June or whatever the date was that year, 1962, while they were graduating, having a little vacation and studying for the bar exam, I was still taking courses to complete my study at the law school. And maybe it was really fortunate. I remember that summer having the course in civil practice, the practice course, then taught by a legendary character at the law school, Herbert Peter Freund. I have to tell you, much as I loved trademarks and intellectual property, I mean, another area that I loved and really were all the intricacies of civil practice, New York civil practice. Just loved it. And here I was spending the summer with him, learning all of this, instead of preparing for the bar exam. But gee, I was, in a sense, wasn't I? But I started at Sullivan and Cromwell in September, I think September 4th. I checked that out. September, it was a Tuesday of 1962. And I had the bar exam ahead of me. I think the bar exam was probably November or something like that. And that was a little difficult, because I remember going to the head of the litigation department at Sullivan and Cromwell at the time, Bill Willis, and asking him for a couple of weeks off to prepare for the bar exam. Another unforgettable moment, a direct quote from Bill Willis: "You don't need 2 or 3 weeks off to study for the bar exam." Unforgettable line. That meant no. I did get a little bit of time, but what was so vexing to me was if I didn't pass the bar exam, then I wasn't the person he thought I was. He said, there are pass-fail people, you're a pass person, you don't need the time. So if I failed, then I was not the person Bill Willis thought I was. That weighed on me too. But guess what? I passed the bar exam, and it all worked out fine.
So what were your early experiences as a first or second year associate at Sullivan and Cromwell?
Well, I remember, first of all, the first time my telephone rang at Sullivan and Cromwell, it was Robert McCrate on the phone. He and I arrived at 48 Wall Street on the same day. He had just been counsel to Governor Rockefeller, and of course I had just come from the NYU Law School. And the phone rang. I was by the way, in a 4-person office, which was not uncommon back then. Kind of interesting. I don't think firms do it anymore, do they? Two people is the most. Around here at Skadden, two would be the most, but we were 4 in an office, probably even a little smaller than the office I'm in right now. Pluses and minuses. We got to know each other really, really well. Now, I'm a person who listens to other people's conversations. If I'm in a restaurant, I can hear everybody's. I listen to all the tables around me. So these 3 men who were with me, they just, I knew everything about their lives, all their telephone conversations, and it was really nice. They were very good company, and only one of the 4 stayed on to be a partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. One of them left before I did. But anyway, back to Bob McCrae. The phone rang, and he said, "Miss Smith, this is Mr. McCrae. Would you come to my office?" And I did. I went to his office. And I said it was his first day back, and it was my first day there, and he picked up a piece of litigation. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was a litigation that was still there when I left the firm, and Bob and I were very, very actively engaged in it. Now, isn't that a great way to start as a young lawyer, and to have as a mentor one of the great mentors of all time, a future president of the American Bar Association, the author of the McCrae Report of 1992, so pivotal to legal education. And one particular thing Bob told me also is a forever lesson. When we went one day to a neighboring law firm, we were out on the street together going for a meeting with co-counsel at Carter Ledyard, and again I remember the young associate, my contemporary, was now longtime United States District Judge Lou Stanton. But as we were walking up Wall Street, Bob said to me, "Now, some partners, some people don't like young associates speaking up at meetings." He said, "I don't feel that way." He said, "If you have something to say, you say it." Now those words echo in my mind a lot. If you remember, I've described to you my feeling about law school and not speaking out and all, how nice it was for Bob to say that to me. And I think very often of those words when I'm wondering, should I say something or shouldn't I? And if I've thought it through and I think it's right, I say it. And I thank Bob for that. So we had that. That went on for a long time. And the other memorable thing is that at Sullivan & Cromwell, in the litigation department, they used to give their young associates these small matters, very small matters for major clients. It was almost like a service. I'm sure they weren't billing at the normal rate. And I had 2 of those. One in the civil court of the city of New York, and one in the civil court in New York County, and the second in Queens County. Unforgettable, both of them. The one in New York County involved a huge client, General Tire, and a woman had her turquoise convertible parked out on a city street, and her hugely expensive tires were stolen. So naturally she sued the tire company, okay? Is that a great case? And that went on in the small claims part, but she was a lawyer, and she was representing herself and determined to recover, I don't know how many, not millions, thousands of dollars. They were expensive tires, but she had a whole story that went with it, but about the serial numbers and the fact that they wouldn't give her the serial number. There's something that she was able to concoct to connect the tire company with the recovery. Well, I won. I defeated that on, I made some kind of motion, but she would come to court with her witnesses and all. It was just really, it was a very good education. The second case out in Queens County was for American Motors, and it was a lawsuit brought by a person who owned a Rambler that he claimed was a lemon, that also, I made a motion to dismiss against American Motors on jurisdictional grounds, and this upset the judge violently. that we would have the nerve to make such a motion. You moved us from the night division into the day division, and that went on for some time too. But I'll tell a ludicrous story about myself, and hope nobody ever watches this. And that is that the salesman, the car salesman, would come to the court. We were going to have a real trial. And one night he offered to drive me back from the Queen's Civil Court. I accepted the ride, and on the way he asked if I'd ever seen submarine races, and I said no. Now, I'm not going to continue the story, but I wound up walking back from where that was, and never again taking a ride like that.
So you did have some courtroom experience during
Had
this
some
first
courtroom
year.
experience, yes, and other experience too.
Did you, what was the majority of the work that you did at the time at Sullivan and Cromwell? Was it writing and research otherwise?
I remember writing and research, and I used to have, so much of my life has been overturned given the change, and I went through a lot. If we'll skip ahead to the post-December 31, 2008 weeks, when I had to decide what to do with my papers, and every day I regret a lot of things that I threw away. But I was pretty vicious about those shredding bins. They delivered a lot of shredding bins to 230 Park Avenue, where 25 plus years of my life resided, and I every day just threw things away. Now, I used to have a big stack of memos that I kept from Judith A. Smith to various people about really interesting subjects. I'm sorry I didn't keep them. For example, I had a memorandum in under 10 pages on the entire law of 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. People have written multi-volume treatises on that section. I had it in under 10 pages. I imagine what that would be worth today. But I did a lot of memo writing, and I know that there were other cases like the one that Bob and I were on, and I distinctly remember one involving a chemical fertilizer plant that malfunctioned. I don't know if that's the one Bob and I were on. I don't think so. I think that was another partner. But what it showed for me, I just really enjoyed what I was doing. As a litigator, and I've always loved this about being a litigator, first of all, a litigator really creates the universe of facts. There are a million facts from which you distill a certain number of facts, and it's kind of interesting to do that and to figure out, you're honest and you have the adversary, but you want to make the best picture for your client. So what you really, really learn the business. I really, really knew the business of building a chemical fertilizer plant, and that stands out for me in the time that I was at Sullivan and Cromwell. So not a bad mixture, and they were just wonderful to me. I remember somebody once saying that one of the reasons I was hired was that they thought I would be good for morale. I never confirmed that. I never confirmed that they thought that, and I never confirmed that I was good for morale. But obviously I had a good time.
What was firm life like? Was there a social aspect?
I think the social aspect of firm life was largely around the dinner table at Massaletti's, which was a restaurant kind of diagonally across the street and in some major building down there, because that's what most of us did every night, which is have dinner together and go back to the office. And now that you turned my attention to Massaletti's, I can tell you of an early experience with one of the lawyers at the dinner table. I said they would all be men, but it was not a gendered situation. It was not social in that sense. But I remember one night hearing one of the young associates, he was maybe a year or two ahead of me, say to the waiter as he was ordering his dinner, he said, I see they brought their 1962 or 1952 Reds up to market. Now he was referring to the wine, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is a group I'm going to have trouble keeping up with. This is, these wine connoisseurs at the table. But the social life was focused on the office, and I say I really did okay. And I remember moving ultimately from my 4-person office I said there was one person who remained on and became a partner, and that was John Cannon. John and I moved from the 4-person office. Our 2 fellow colleagues had gone. We moved to a 3-person office, and our 3rd person was Paul Grand, who is a very, very distinguished criminal lawyer, and he's founded a firm with Bob Morvillo and I think Elkin Abramowitz, and we continue to be friends to this day. I remember Paul's unhappiness at being on this massive antitrust case, and he vowed the day that case ended he was out of the firm, and that's exactly what happened. But we got to be good friends, all of us.
So during this time...
In fact, right behind me, there's a picture of Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, a drawing, and it was one day when I was in my chambers at 230 Park Avenue that John Cannon called from Sullivan and Cromwell. He said, Judith, they're deaccessioning some art here, and I have something I think you would enjoy having. So that's a link to Sullivan and Cromwell. John came up and brought me this beautiful picture of Benjamin Nathan Cardozo, which I haven't seen anywhere else, and I think it is a real treasure, and I'm happy to have it. It's a beautiful picture of Benjamin Nathan Cardozo. It reminds me of John, and it's a gift from Sullivan and Cromwell.
So during this time, you remained the only woman in the litigation
Yes,
department?
yes. Mm-hmm.
And was there any, did you remember that having any significance?
Oh, well, I say I again, after the arrow of Casey Lane and Mittendorf, I think I settled down once I was at Sullivan and Cromwell. I certainly noticed, always noticed that I was different, that never escaped notice. And particularly, I remember firm meetings, not firm meetings, but litigation department meetings. I guess if there were things like firm outings, I'm not sure, I don't remember. I remember in a later chapter of my life that I was not, as the only woman, not invited to the firm outing, but I don't remember that at Sullivan and Cromwell. But I do remember the lunch club that many of the lawyers went to, which had a special women's entrance, and I walked through the women's entrance without thinking that I should have staged a protest and walked through the men's entrance. Probably would do that today, these days that I walk into a men's room if there's a line outside the women's room. But anyway, that aside, I do remember litigation department meetings starting with Gentleman and Judy. That was how they began. So yes, they noticed, I noticed, and we did okay.
Were there any effects based on religion at the time?
Well, there was you've really reminded me of the fact that I think Jewish, in the evolution of society, the progress of society, there was a time when it was very difficult for Jewish lawyers in these white shoe law firms, and hard for them to get employment. And I do remember one vestige, even in the year 1962, which was some athletic club, that one of like the Downtown Athletic Club or one of those athletic clubs, not that I sought membership, but the person who later became my husband did. He was Jewish, and he was just very kindly, it was kindly suggested to him that he withdraw his application, which he did. I'll never forget, too, one of the associates at the firm, one day I was drafting an affidavit for one of the partners, Marvin Schwartz, very distinguished, wonderful lawyer, and this associate who had a bit of an English accent, I think he spent about 20 minutes abroad, he picked up the draft one day and he said, "Marvin Schwartz? Do we really have a Marvin Schwartz in this firm?" So I noticed that too. But I think we were at the tail end of that, and what we've seen in the great evolution of our profession, I don't know why it takes us so long. I say we call ourselves the justice system with diversity in our profession, and we're certainly coming through that now, but there are these eras and episodes, right? And you can't forget them ever, because it's so important that we keep our doors open and that we offer, we of all people in the justice system, that there be genuine equal opportunity. And it's been a long struggle.
So you mentioned your husband.
Yes.
Did you meet your husband, Stephen?
Yes.
Sullivan and Cromwell?
I met Stephen, my husband, at Sullivan and Cromwell, my late husband. We had 43 glorious years of marriage. And I know, Anne, you cherish him too. Actually, we met at a firm function. Arthur Dean at the time was the managing partner, and he had some party where the whole firm was invited, and that I met Stephen that night. Of course, I had seen him around the firm for months, although he was not there a lot because he did a lot of work for El Paso, the company, and spent a lot of time in Texas and other parts of the United States. And so I did see Stephen, but I didn't get to know him until that night when we really met at Arthur Dean's. And from that point on, Stephen and I had a clandestine relationship. It would not have been a good thing for me, given what it was to arrive in a law firm like that, to be perceived as looking for social opportunities. And Stephen felt it too, that for whatever, that just, if, for us to be openly seeing one another. And this is another evolution in organizational life. Even we have partners in this law firm who are married, but back then you just wouldn't have done it. And I remember one couple where the woman left, where they were seeing each other. So we had this secret romance, and I have to tell you, having a secret romance when you're around the city of New York, when you're in a big law firm, it's easy because nobody ever goes anywhere but like to Massoletti's. So we were able to go to the opera and the theater and just everything and never meet anybody except once, when we ran into a partner of the firm having dinner with a woman who was not his wife. She was a paralegal at the firm. So our secret was safe with him. Stephen and I, the relationship just grew and grew. Then Stephen left the firm. He went to Proskauer, where Anne is currently, and he remained on at Proskauer for 45 years, but we began to plan our marriage, which eventually took place in February of 1964, I left the firm too.
So during this time, just to step back to your family, had they changed their early apprehension about your becoming a lawyer?
Yeah, my family had come around to my being a lawyer. They were pretty proud, I think. They felt really good. First of all, the fact that I was earning $7,200, and I think there was a bonus. I remember it got to be $9,000 that first year. In Monticello, New York, I was pretty good, and they were proud. I remember my mother coming from Monticello to my admission to the bar in the first department. They both couldn't come because the store had to be kept open. But my mother came, and she was clearly really, really pleased to see. And the other thing I remember about that event, which didn't dawn on me, I was dense. I really was dense. I was seated in the front row in the beautiful appellate division courtroom on 25th Street. It didn't occur to me until years later that there were probably 3 or 4 other women, and we were all put in the front seat. But I thought it was kind of nice to be seated in the front seat, in the front row, and I realized I was placed there just because there were so few of us. They were singling us out. Yeah, my parents were pleased, and it was very nice. I'm sure Lawyer Weiss congratulated them, so things were okay.
Did you ever discuss the law or your experiences learning about it with your family?
No, we never talked about the law. Politics, yeah. So I guess you'd have to go back and redefine the law, but I think I understand the thrust of your question, and no, we never sat around. Like, my daughter is, of course, Stephen, my late husband, was a lawyer. Our daughter is a lawyer. The nicest thing, absolutely the nicest thing that happened to me was that my daughter became a lawyer. I'm proud that she's a lawyer. That's not the reason. The reason is she can't be that much of a masochist. She would not have become a lawyer unless, and she has 3 children, unless her life growing up was okay in retrospect. That was kind of a seal of approval that I was really happy to have, because As we all know, the practice of law is very demanding, and I was fortunate enough to have 3 fantastic children and a very great married life, and I have 7 wonderful grandchildren. But you worry all the time about, there are a lot of tensions and a lot of stresses, and I think especially for women, we can come back to that at any time you like. But when my daughter became a lawyer, wow. And I think my parents felt the same. They were pretty pleased, even though, regrettably, they weren't able to show people in Monticello pictures of their grandchildren.
And at this time, you were no longer living with your grandmother or your aunt.
Yes,
That
evolved too. And I'll just spend a moment telling you about my residence during law school, because I moved down to the village, love the village. The village is great, although I don't live there. I live on the Upper West Side now. But during my law school years, it was just more convenient, especially, you know, going to night law school, working in Midtown, travel up to, well, it wouldn't have been the Bronx, it would have been the Upper West Side. It was just much easier to live in the area of the law school. I was lucky to find a room. I passed the building often at 43 Fifth Avenue, 11th Street and 5th Avenue. If you look way up to the top, it's a beautiful building. It's a Sanford White building. But way up to the top, you see these little garret windows, and those must have been rooms for service people in the old days. I wonder what they do with that space today. But I learned during my law school years that there was a woman who had a large apartment and I could rent a room from her, which I did at 43 Fifth Avenue. But as soon as I got there, I discovered these garret rooms on the top floor. So I didn't have to have a room in her apartment. I could have a room of my own. And believe me, a room of my own was, you know, just tiny. It had virtually nothing in it, but it was great during law school to live there. You know, there was a common bathroom. I have no idea who else lived in those rooms. But I did keep that little room all through law school, and it worked beautifully. But as soon as I got a job, I was determined to continue living in the village. In fact, when I lived in the village and worked at Sullivan and Cromwell, I would consider going to 14th Street uptown, like, you know, never went above 14th Street. We can have a whole life below 14th Street in the city of New York. But I got an apartment at 3 Sheridan Square, which was a brand new building, and again, when I passed 43 Fifth Avenue and I passed 3 Sheridan Square, I just have all those wonderful memories of my time there. But Stephen and I moved after we were married to the east side, 34th Street. We were there only a short time. We're genuine West Siders, and that's where we've been.
So you were planning your wedding and at the same time planning your departure from Sullivan and Cromwell?
Well, I was planning my wedding. I was not planning my I knew I would leave Sullivan and Cromwell, but I didn't plan it. I guess that's another theme of my life, that sometimes I just stumble into things, and I've been awfully lucky. I was planning the wedding, and I remember the day I picked up my wedding invitations. I say Stephen and I had a clandestine romance. I didn't tell anybody, even after Stephen left, about our relationship. But I picked up my wedding invitations one day, and when I got back to the firm, there was a young lawyer there named John Clark, who had worked a lot with Stephen, traveled to Texas a lot with Stephen, knew Stephen really, really well. And I said, John, I've just picked up my wedding invitations. And he said, how great. He said, I didn't know you were going to get married. Are you marrying a lawyer? And I said, yes. And he said, what firm is he with? And I said, he's with the Proskauer firm. He said, you know, Steve Kaye just went with the Proskauer firm. I said, yes, John, that's the person I'm marrying. Well, you know, poor John, he just slipped under the table. So I did plan the wedding. Stephen and I planned the wedding, and we had a lovely wedding. But I decided I would leave Sullivan and Cromwell. It was just, I just felt it was just healthier all around, since Stephen had spent a number of years there. And it just seemed like a better choice to do that. But I knew I would work immediately someplace, but I never gave a moment's thought to where. And as I was making the rounds saying goodbye to people at the firm, somebody said, "Where are you going next?" And oh my goodness, yeah, that was a really good question. He said, you should call Ken Segerman. He just left and he went to IBM. Maybe that would be of interest. And, I thought, gee, I never thought of going to IBM, but I called Ken Segerman. He arranged for me to come up to 59th Street and Madison Avenue to meet the legal people at IBM, and I met one of the zaniest, most wonderful lawyers I've ever known, H. Bardo Farr, Jr. I think his father was co-founder of the firm of Wilkie Farr, but Bardo was marvelously zany. And here he was, the head of the lawyers there at IBM. I mean, like, he had an actor's equity card and would be on divorce court every now and then. He hated fluorescent lights. He would remove them every night from his ceiling, and they would put them back. There were things like that I remember about Bardo, but he was a great lawyer and just a terrific fellow. And he made me an offer that very first time we were together. But he said, "There's something I have to tell you. IBM is moving up to Armonk, New York. Before you accept an offer here, you should drive up to Armonk and just see what you think of the commute, because we're only going to be here for another 6 months or so." So Stephen and I drove up to Armonk, or what we thought was Armonk. Seemed fine. The next day I called and accepted the job. Imagine my surprise when 6 months later I discovered we had not been to Armonk. We had been to Harrison, to the IBM facility in Harrison, and Armonk was another half an hour away. Would I have accepted the job? Oh, probably. Yeah, I think so. But that was kind of a shock. And anyway, another great lucky incident befell me, and we had a car, but there was this really nice fellow there, Howard something or other, who had no car, lived a block away from me, another person who was going to be moving up to Armonk. He said, "I've got an idea," or I said, "I have an idea. Why don't you come every day, Howie, and let's drive together in our car." And that's what we did. So it was never, I could just sit and read or do anything, and he would drive, and that's how I got back and forth every single day. Not bad. And had a great time at IBM. Great time. It was, first of all, there was Bardo. Then they were on the cusp of a couple of really interesting things I remember, like simultaneous translations, which had copyright implications, and they were getting into the photocopy business, which they ultimately did, and I think got out of it as well. But I wasn't there for the getting out. But I got to do some really interesting stuff at IBM, and genuinely enjoyed the little slice of life I had on House Counsel staff. Really interesting. Like the first day I was there, when my phone rang, it was somebody from IBM asking me about taking the flag in bad weather. And that was just so dazzling to me, because you wouldn't call Sullivan and Cromwell and ask a lawyer at Sullivan and Cromwell what the law was on taking the flag in bad weather. But House Counsel, yeah, you'd ask House Counsel that. And I went to the library, discovered a volume of the code, U.S. Code annotated, called Flag. I think it was volume like 14 or something like that. And I answered his question, but it was a different experience, and one that I treasure as I do the time that I had at Sullivan and Cromwell.
What was the answer to the question?
You take the flag in when the weather is bad. But this, I wasn't now here's a difference from my tax experience at NYU Law School. I was not prepared to give him the common sense answer. Fortunately, the law provided the common sense answer.
And how long did you remain at IBM?
I stayed there about a year because they had a policy that required departure by the 7th month of a pregnancy. I became pregnant, I don't know, shortly after Stephen and I were married. And I think I pretty much stayed through like the 8th month. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. But then I had to leave. They were very generous with benefits. And again, what's interesting here, Anne, is that these are things nobody was ever ashamed about. You weren't ashamed to say our quota of women is filled. You weren't ashamed to have separate entrances for women, if you got into the place at all. And you weren't ashamed to say you have to leave if you're pregnant. I mean, these are things that would be illegal today. I mean, this has been, we're talking about a long time ago and a big evolution. But nobody, that was just the policy. They're very generous with their benefits. Please come back. The day you're ready to come back, we're ready to have you come back. But you're out of here. If you're pregnant, you're out of here.
And these policies didn't surprise you at the time either,
No, not at all. That was just the normal corporate policy, probably in the book that I read when I went to the corporation. But I knew I had to go. It was evident that I had to go. I went down to the NYU Law School to see if there was a little project I could pick up because I didn't want to sit at home. I remember at the time that someone, whether it was I was going to do a volunteer kind of thing and just anything to bridge a couple of months. But the dean at the time, Russell Niles, was looking for an assistant. He was a real property law teacher, and he had a casebook on real property law. He wanted someone to update it. And I said I would do it. Yuck, I didn't want to do that. That never has been one of my all-time favorite subjects. I like it, but the idea of just immersing myself in updating a real property law casebook was not at the top of my list. I accepted the job. Let's see, my daughter was born in March, and so it must have been, I think the elections at the City Bar Association are like May, but maybe a little earlier. The swearing in is in May. Almost at the moment that I accepted Dean Niles' offer, he was elected the president of what was then called Association of the Bar of the City of New York. Today, the City Bar Association, great, wonderful bar association on 44th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues. And instead of updating his real property casebook, which I never touched, never had to touch, I got a little office at the City Bar Association and was right alongside Dean Niles in the myriad wonderful issues that come to the City Bar Association. Fantastic. We had such a good time. We turned out a couple of articles. I remember he was very interested in judicial selection methods. I don't remember what else we wrote. He spoke, and I always was at his side and helped him get prepared for things. So that's a 2-year term. So I stayed on for his whole 2 years and had 2 babies. Worked so well with one. Louisa was born in March of that year, and then a year and a half later I had Jonathan. In the second, as the term of his presidency was coming to an end, and he never noticed that I never touched his real property casebook, he asked me, he was going to leave as dean, and Professor DeCaprilis, who taught corporate finance, was coming on, but he had a big booking in Sweden, some massive conference on corporate finance, and he really needed some help, and with his course as well. So for the 3rd year, I stayed with Dean DeCaprilis, and I had another baby. So that all worked really well. The 3 kids arrived in those years, and I was kept very gainfully occupied by NYU Law School. Gordy was about 6 months old when I was thinking, I had the 3-year-old, the 2-year-old, and the newborn. I was thinking I really should start to look for a return to the world of law firms.
How was it being a young mother and a working mother? And what were the years? Can you give us the years?
Well, let's see. I say Louisa was born in March of 1965, and Gordy was the youngest, then Jonathan in September of 66, and Gordy in September of 68. I say I was with Dean Niles and Dean DeCaprilis. I don't think I ever missed a paycheck, although I say that was never my objective. But it worked out fine with the hours I could be at the city bar, at the law school. I remember once asking Dean Niles for a raise. I was an independent contractor. I asked him for a raise, and I remember his saying it was hard to get more money, and he said, work less. That was interesting. But it was great. Those were very satisfactory years. And so the part about being a mother and a wife and a lawyer, that worked out okay. But when Gordy was 6 months old, I wanted to return to the world of law firms. And it was actually Stephen who called the firm, somebody he knew at the firm of Oldline, Conley, Chase, O'Donnell, and Wire. We had decided, Stephen and I, that maybe I could manage part-time employment as a litigator. Such a thing, I don't know how we came upon it. It was not, certainly not in the mainstream. It was not normal. Law firms still were not hiring women, so now to sign on with 3 tiny children and part-time. I think later they called it the mommy track because I got lambasted when I wrote a piece supporting this kind of arrangement. But I got to tell you, for me, it worked really well. So Stephen called his friend at Oldline Conley and suggested this part-time arrangement, and that's what I did. And I remember the salary, and I think for Oldline, what was really attractive was whatever the salary was, they were going to pay me half. Which I think really appealed to them, because always I had somebody full-time in the house, so I always had the option, if I had to go, remain late, if I had to go in, at night or so, there was always somebody there in the house, which was, this was the day before daycare, a time before daycare. There were no daycare facilities, but I had a good at-home living arrangement. So Oldline took me on part-time, and what always brings tears to my eyes, and probably will now as I say these words, is, I don't think I can say them. I'll try to say them. That the day I left for the Court of Appeals, Jack O'Donnell, the head of the litigation department at Oldline Conley, called Stephen and said, "We're losing our part-time lawyer." I was going on the Court of Appeals. He said, "Could you recommend another one for us?" And it was just very sweet. But I stayed at Oldline for 15 years.
Judge, before we continue with your return to litigation, I just want to close the chapter on IBM, or at least continue the chapter on IBM. Did you see Bartow far after that time?
Oh, goodness, yes, I saw Bartow. That Bartow, I think he passed away not that long ago. And I believe his son is a major, United States Supreme Court litigator in Washington, D.C. Bartow was phenomenal, really phenomenal. We kept up our friendship, but we did have one particularly memorable meeting. I mean, just to tell you how I use the word zany to describe Bartow, meaning it only in the most highly complimentary form. He turned in Singer or IBM. He would turn in, if he saw things that were illegal, he would turn in people to the Justice Department. He was just so profoundly ethical and wonderful, and I say in all the years afterwards we maintained our relationship. But I remember one time in particular, he became the chief counsel for IBM abroad, and then he returned to at least the Singer Company, because I remember his sending some matters to me. And we whenever he was in New York, he wound up living in the South someplace for his employer. Whenever he was in New York, we would always meet, at least for lunch. And there was one time, it was a club, we were meeting at his club on Park Avenue. I don't remember the name of the club, but I was to show up there for lunch to meet him, and or at least to meet him there. It was around lunchtime, and I got there a little early and said to the person at the desk that Judith Kaye, I'm here to meet Bartow Farr. I think he's in the dining room. He told me he's going to be in the dining room. Could you just show me which way it is? And the fellow at the desk said, "I'm sorry, but no women are permitted in the dining room." Well, I got Bartow out of the dining room. I said, "Bartow, they don't permit women in the dining room." He withdrew from the club that day. We went out and had lunch someplace else, and he withdrew from the club. And actually, I think that got to be a little public too, which was very nice. So by now my consciousness was definitely raised to these gender issues.
So you returned to your life as a commercial litigator,
yes,
part-time at Ogilvy.
Olwine.
I'm sorry, excuse me, at Olwine. And how long did you continue part-time?
Well, again, it's hard to define part-time when you're a litigator. I know I started 3 days a week, which kind of morphed into 4 and 5 and 6, and I can't tell you exactly when the lines were drawn. But it seemed to be okay. I say the critical thing was having some stable household situation, which I was fortunate to have. It worked. It worked. And I did I believe it was the late 70s. Let's see, I would have gone there, and Gordy was born in September 68, so he was just a few months old when I went to Olwine. That would have been early 69, and in a few years I became a partner, but that's its own story too, because I didn't think there were no other women at the firm. The prospects of my becoming a partner I thought were very bleak as I looked at the masthead after a couple of years. There were like 8 or 9 people ahead of me, and wonderful as the firm was, they were successful in keeping the partnership very small and the associate rank very large. So I decided one day that I was never going to be a partner at the firm, and I contacted a headhunter and began looking for some other employment. At the time, Exxon was looking. Suddenly, it went from women being excluded to suddenly the desire to have one. Now there was a quota of women that maybe was 1 or 2, but finally someone. And Exxon then on 6th Avenue and 51st Street, and location is relevant too. They were very eager to have a woman in the firm. And I remember having a couple of interviews there, being made an offer while I was at Olwine, accepting the offer. I was determined that I would go to Exxon. I say that that location is relevant because not many years later Exxon moved out of New York to Texas. I don't know what I would have done, but I did accept the offer, fully intending to leave Olwine Conley and go to Exxon. There was a good opportunity. Maybe I would be general counsel. That's what I was thinking. But when I went back to Olwine and told them that I was leaving, and they said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I'm never going to be a partner here. I don't think I want to stay." They said, No, don't go. You'll be a partner. We'll make you a partner right away." And I said, "Well, I don't think you're really serious about my being a partner." "No, we're really serious about your being a partner. Stay, you have to stay." I became a partner at Olwine. That's how it happened. That's really how it happened.
Were you the only woman partner?
Oh, yes. I'm not sure there were many women by the time that happened in the firm at all. Certainly no other women partners. And there's just an interesting little sidelight here, Anne, that you've reminded me of, and that was, you see the kind of person I am, and I think I've always been this kind of person. And I remember this one woman, poor thing, really, Mary Jo. I wonder where she is today. But she was the blustery, cussing kind of woman. She came into my office one day, closed the door, and she said, "You make me sick." She said, "You're so prissy." That was just incredible, really, because Mary Jo did not become a partner at the Olwine firm, and I did. I guess the moral here, the tale here, is just be the person you are. I guess I don't think her cussing is what disqualified her. I think she was just not deemed to be worthy of being a partner, but the fact is, being the other kind of person, if that's the other kind of person you are, just be yourself.
On that note, do you have any advice for women?
Well, the only advice I ever give, well, I do have, I jokingly say I always advise, especially women lawyers, never to buy a wrap skirt, and I mean that, well, of course, seriously, it's very uncomfortable when you're in court and all to be worrying about a wrap skirt. But I guess, I mean, the serious note is that I'm very reluctant to give advice to people because it's such a personal thing. Your life is so personal, and you just have to figure things out minute to minute and day by day and month by month and year by year and make the best judgments that you can. But as I've grown older in this profession, I'm bold enough now to give some advice, and especially to women, and that is just to never give up, to just persevere and keep coming back, whatever, if you have a goal in mind. If you close yourself out of it, then everybody else will too. So I do urge that on especially women today, and I think kind of things are tough for women today. That's my observation as I travel around the law firm world. Very different from 1960, whatever it was that I was in the firms, but still a challenge for the women. And I think that word about perseverance and persistence and just never giving up and never letting people talk you out of what you really know in your heart that you want to do, I think that's important.
This seems a good place to pause, but I would like to ask you, because we're approaching a big change in your life, from leaving the law firm of Allwine. You were there for more than 10 years.
I think I was there for more than 15 years. Mm-hmm.
And over that time, I know you had mentors and you had some significant cases. And what are your recollections of that period of time that stand out?
What stands out? Okay, well, first, when you use the word mentor, I in the litigation department, was very fortunate to have some very caring people. And just the other night, I was over at a celebration for the Feerick Center, and ran into the gentleman who I was so close to, Jim Tolan, and so we exchanged a few greetings. It was Jim was a staunch advocate and at my side always, and there he is, still working and great. And I was well treated at Allwine and persevered. But on my wall here in this office, and something I've always hung on to, when you ask for things that stand out in my mind, there's something in a small frame, because I had a litigation before Edward Weinfeld. The irony is the person right next door to me, it is a small world. We can hardly talk about anything that doesn't touch all of us, is a lawyer named Barry Garfinkel, who was a law clerk to Edward Weinfeld. I had this matter, a very large matter, that was referred to me by Bardo Farr. So it was an extremely important and very adversarial litigation. It was important in and of itself to the company, but it was important to me because Bardo put it into my hands, and I needed to make it perfect. And it was a matter, it was a suit against the client I was representing. We were the defendants. I was the lead counsel for the defendant. And it was before Edward Weinfeld. And the joke I make is there are two, I was mostly in the federal courts. Edward Weinfeld was a Southern District judge, and the other judge I appeared before in a hotly contested litigation over a long period was Milton Pollock. And the joke I make was that I was a much different person before those two people really gave me a bruising lesson in being a trial lawyer, for which I am eternally grateful to them. I really learned how to be a good trial lawyer in the skirmishes that went on for years and years in both of those litigations. But the litigation in particular, where Bardo was my client and this major corporation, we made some good law that's in the books. But at the end of the trial, which was it was a jury trial that went on for weeks, Judge Weinfeld called us both up, my adversary and myself, and he said that he thought we did a terrific job, both of us. He said he apologized for letting go every once in a while, and believe me, he did. But he said he thought we both did an excellent job. Now, getting a compliment like that from Edward Weinfeld, I mean, I would put that on my resume if I were circulating my resume, but instead of that, I that day ordered that page out of the transcript, and I I had it framed for myself and for my adversary, who I had grown to hate. I sent it over to him, and he has it on his wall to this day, and I have it on my wall to this day. And we remain friends. So that, when you've driven me back to my years of practice at Old Wine Conley, I remember that too. Bought lots of bar association work, legal aid. I was on the board of the Legal Aid Society. I mean, it was a pretty nice life. And if I ever thought being a judge, and I did, from time to time, I mean, how can you be a litigator and in the courts all the time and not think about being a judge? It would have been the federal bench. And one day in the early 80s, Arthur Lyman, who was a good friend, he was from the Legal Aid Society board and just generally from litigation, he called me. This was a moment in time when being a woman was not only not a bad thing, but even was a good thing, because people suddenly realized that, yes, Eve is still alive. There is another gender in this profession. And Arthur called one day and said that they're desperately looking for women with trial experience for the Southern District of New York. And his words, and again I remember the direct quote, "Get your papers in right away." Those were Arthur's words. I think I could have had that. But at the same time, I got on my desk one day, the Commission on Judicial Nomination for the Court of Appeals of the State of New York. Wow. I mean, that was something I really couldn't in my wildest imagination think I would ever be considered for the Court of Appeals of the State of New York. And so you've taken me to the next chapter, I think.